Hello and welcome to InvestorToday.ca. My name is Dave Glover. InvestorToday.ca is brought to you in conjunction with RBL Communications, social media IR solutions for public companies. Today we'll be continuing in our series of conversations with Mr. Redmond Weissenberger. Mr. Weissenberger is the director of the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Canada. That's www.mises.ca. Good day, Redmond, and welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Thank you very much, Dave, for having me on your show again. I really enjoyed the last time.
Yeah, we've had some pretty good feedback so far, and hopefully we'll get more and more. Today's topic of conversation, as I outlined to the listeners, was the separation of state and economy, which was something you and I talked about at the sort of the after show of our last broadcast.
Well, I think it's very important for people to understand that from the very fact that government has a monopoly on the production of money. So right there, government is involved in half of every transaction that goes on, right? And then why I seem to believe that we need I believe that we need a separation of state and economy is that. If you look at the 20th century, which was the bloodiest, most destructive century in human history, over 100 million murdered essentially by the communists and various people.
Well, I just want to,
much of that was about it was all focused on economics. It was all focused on how are you going to produce, how are you going to create wealth, how are you going to spread wealth around, all these sorts of different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the 20th century, I don't think we had a 25-year period where there wasn't some type of major conflict.
Yeah, well, war has been sort of a constant throughout history. I mean, the Europeans have been murdering each other for hundreds of, if not thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only recently, it's only been in the last 50, since the end of World War II, that there's actually been a fairly stable Europe where, armies weren't crossing borders on a regular basis. But yeah, essentially, the battles of the 20th century, the large ones fought over, how countries are going to be run, fought over socialism, communism, capitalism, these sort of battles of these two ideologies, were all focused around economics. Now, you look at the Enlightenment, what people were fighting for then, people were fighting for a separation of church and state, right? Because they saw that, the influence of the church over the state or the state over the church and religious freedoms is what people were fighting for. Right? And of course you had massive amounts of murder and death, all focused around religion. The Catholics and the Protestants were fighting. The Crusaders were going into the Middle East and taking over and killing people, and then of course the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire grew, and they were in Spain taking over. It was all about religion, and you can see that within the U.S. Constitution, right? You had this specific separation between church and state. But now what we have, but of course within the American Constitution as well, they did recognize the necessity of having money that was sound. But over the last 100 years, what we've really seen is far too much involvement of the state within the economy to the detriment of populations at large. And I'm not just talking about the people who were killed, because they didn't support the state's control of the economy, but even the social welfare state that we see now going bankrupt around us really has really been destroying and undermining the foundations of of a real economy, and by that I mean the private economy,
right,
around the world.
Right,
and is leading to poverty on a mass scale. If you look at what's going on in Europe right now, in Greece, it's just all about the pensions and the ability of people to redistribute wealth. There's a guy, Frederick Bastiat, had to put it a good way. He said, government is the attempt of everyone to live at the expense of everyone else. And essentially, the Greeks have been really getting that one down. Taking money from the ECB, taking money from the German taxpayer. Essentially, what's been going on in Europe is that they've been attempting to set up a federal transfer system like we have in Canada.
Right.
So we'll take money from Alberta and ship it to Newfoundland, or we'll ship it to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Or in the modern sense, Ontario, right?
Oh, yeah, and now Ontario, because we're destroying, Ontario is destroying its own economy through and destroying, we're destroying our own economy through things like the Green Energy Act, high unionization in the manufacturing sector. And, of course, remember, a lot of this unionization has been forced by the government, right? High unionization in the manufacturing sector, which is pricing us out of the international manufacturing market we've recently had. And the thing is that the government interventions in the market, essentially what they're attempting to do, say with the federal transfers program, right? They're attempting to sort of freeze everything in place, right? Before we had this massive wealth transfer system, right? So if people said they couldn't find a job in Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, for a long time people would come to Ontario. Now you've got massive amounts of Newfoundlanders and people from the east to move west to Calgary, and so they actually, Calgary in Calgary and whatnot, and in the oil sands, the cost of labor is very high because they need more people. Now, what we've got right now is a system where, if you live in the east, you only have to work something like 450 hours, and then you can qualify for full unemployment insurance benefits, right?
Right.
And that is because they're saying, well, this is their way of life. They can only find jobs as fishermen for 3 months of the year. But it's but the whole point is that we want people to go where the work is. We don't want them to be sitting there on pogey for as they call it for 6-9 months of the year. And
right.
I remember years ago I used to work in a call center in Ottawa, and I met some guy who used to live out in Nova Scotia, and he said it was often heavily abused. Right? You'd have one person would go on EI, and then they would quit, and then their cousin would get hired, or their cousin would get a job, and then they would be laid off, and then they'd go on EI, and then the next cousin would be hired, or whatever.
But the system has changed. You can't quit your job now and get employment insurance. So they have put in some stopgap measures, if you will.
Yeah, but it's still heavily, it still heavily favors stasis. But essentially, if you want to talk about more back to separation of state and economy, the real problem is that the constant economic intervention causes massive distortions in the market. Right?
Well, we can see that with the rise of inflation. We can see that with the amount of money that's being printed in the United States, for instance, right now to keep their economy kind of chugging along. But really,
well, it's not chugging along. That's the whole point. It isn't chugging along there. If you look at they just came out with some new unemployment figures, and they say, oh well, hey, look, some jobs were created, but they don't count things like people who have given up looking for work. They don't count people who are on full-time benefits. If you look at the average number of weeks that people have been unemployed in the United States, it's the highest it's ever been since World War II. Right? I think the average is 44 weeks, but you've had a whole class of people called the 99ers.
Right.
Right? And these are people who have been on unemployment benefits now in the United States for 99 weeks. And one of the reasons for that is that with the housing bubble, what the U.S. has done is created a whole class of people who are underwater on their mortgages, who but also aren't willing to essentially go through the foreclosure process and declare bankruptcy.
Right.
And so they can't move to where the jobs are. And so you've got people who are stuck in, say, Las Vegas, tied to a house, right? Who can't sell it. They don't want to. They're not prepared to foreclose and declare bankruptcy. They could be moving to places like North Dakota, where there's a huge boom because of the fracking industry, right? They're exploiting all this oil that they hadn't been able to exploit before, natural gas, these sorts of things. and this push for intervention into the economy, it comes out of the 19th century, right? A lot of it comes out of the 19th century.
Sure.
The Communist Manifesto was written in 1948.
1848, right?
Or 1848, right? And they're looking, and within that he says all these things. He says the destruction of private property, centralization of credit within the hands of the state, within the central bank. Already Marx was saying they wanted a central bank. And the idea, and of course the funny thing about Marx, that if you start reading a bit of his biography, you realize that he's sort of the original Occupy Wall Streeter. He was part of a wealthy family. He was sort of dropping in and out of college all the time. Yet he basically almost never had a real job. His parents essentially bankrolled him for the first part of his life, and then he was bankrolled by Engels, for the rest of his life. And I think when he was living in London, England, he was actually he was getting a good amount of money every month to sort of support his lifestyle. And what people don't realize, of course, if you look at the period previous to the 19th century and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, you had a small elite at the top controlling most of the economy. You had a large amount of just basically dirt poor people. A lot of people were just involved in farming. They were serfs, right? It was, in fact, capitalism and the free market, individuals who were allowed to innovate, create wealth, hire people. These were the people who created the rise in the standard of living and enabled a middle class to exist.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
It wasn't government intervention during the night, especially the mid to late 19th century. You had essentially what was called the Manchester system in the UK. You would also know it as laissez-faire. In the United States, there was something known as the night watchman state. Where you had a very tiny state. It was basically funded on tariffs. There was no income tax. And that's when you had the largest radical increase in the quality of life.
Right.
Now, of course, there were, obviously, on occasion, the quality of life back then compared to what we have today, you couldn't compare them. And of course, that being said, the richest person in those days, had the equivalent medical services of somebody in a third world country today, or worse. There was no high technology.
Well, there's definitely been some changes. Obviously, some progression, some progress, if you will, new technologies and things of that nature.
But again, all of that stuff is coming out of the private market.
Absolutely.
It's not.
Well, but let's look at the military-industrial complex of the 20th century that was basically used to fund research and development in a lot of these companies.
Well, fund research and development in weapon systems and these sorts of things. You don't see medical technology coming out of the military-industrial complex.
Well, I don't know. There were a number of medical advances made during the First World War. Thank you very much to government intervention. I don't want to say
such as but all the great ones, penicillin, the elimination of smallpox, vaccines, all this stuff came out of the private sector. It
Absolutely.
didn't come out of government.
So we got
maybe they learned how to treat people who had their legs blown off, but they didn't need to have their legs blown off to figure out how to treat having their legs blown off.
No, absolutely. Well, we got about a minute and a half left here.
Yeah.
I want to, if we can, is there a solution? Is there a suggestion? Like, does the state just say, forget it, and we back out of the economic realm? Because I know the U.S. Congress is not going to give up their control of the economy.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah. If you want more wealth, the thing is that government doesn't create wealth, and if you want the average living standards of Canadians to increase, more wealth needs to be created. Government does not create that wealth. The private sector creates that wealth.
Right.
All the government can do is tax it away, and largely, and government is incredibly inefficient as well, right? If you've got a program for the poor, and if the government taxes you $100 and wants to provide a program for the poor, 90% of that 90% of that $100, $90 out of that $100 is going to go to the bureaucracy. It's going to go to the lawmakers. The gold-plated pensions that that politicians and bureaucrats have. 10% might make it down to the poor.
Right.
That's what you're going to see, and then that 10% that makes it down to the poor, it will probably end up dissuading them from actually seeking employment.
Well, again, that's arguable. I'm going to have to leave it there, though, Redmond. Obviously, we're going to have to pick this conversation up. There's still so much more to talk about when we talk about a separation of state and economy. Obviously, It's going to be a huge hurdle if that is the goal of individuals, a goal of nations, to try and wrestle back control, if you will, of the economies from these state-controlled institutions.
Oh yeah, there's so many different issues you could talk about, such as milk marketing boards. Essentially, we have a command and control milk system, egg system. We only recently just got rid of the wheat marketing board.
Well, it's still there. There's actually some legislation. They tried to introduce the removal of it, but that's been blocked, and there's now a group that's filed a legal action against the federal government to have that stopped.
But that's crazy. They were putting people in jail for selling their wheat on the free market.
Right.
And the other crazy thing about that specifically was that it only applied to people in the prairies. It doesn't apply to people in Ontario or Quebec. It's crazy. But if you want to learn more about, the Austrian School of Economics and, Mises Canada, you can head over to www.mises.ca, and that's the Mises Institute of Canada, the Center for the Study of Austrian School of Economics.
And that's great. So I urge the listeners to check that out if you are interested in, or at least educate yourself on the alternative views, if you will. And the Mises Institute is definitely one place to go for that.
Well, and I think that's the thing, is that we're sort of stuck right now in this sort of age of sort of zombie Keynesianism, and unfortunately Keynesianism died. Keynesianism died in the 1970s, and for whatever reason it's reared its ugly head again, and I just did a whole interview with Stefan Molyneux of Freedom Domain Radio all about Keynesianism, and that should be coming out in the next day or two as well.
Okay, so people can look forward to that. And you're also going to be contributing to the Dollar Vigilante, I understand.
Yeah, I've sort of created a relationship with a guy named Jeff Berwick, and he runs a site called the Dollar Vigilante. So he's looking at sort of offering people advice on the coming, sort of the radical, what's going on now with the U.S. dollar is we're seeing a radical devaluation of the dollar, or eventually we're going to see a radical devaluation of the dollar. Around the world, the entire world is on a fiat currency system, right? So governments can print money at will, which, again, looking at the separation of church and economy, or state and economy, they can destroy people's wealth overnight.
Absolutely.
And that happened in 40 countries since 1971. Argentina has destroyed its currency 4 times in 40 years, and it makes it impossible for people to save, to plan for the future, these sorts of things. So, but Jeff's whole point of view and what he's offering to sort of his subscribers and the readers of his website is advice on how to sort of help protect yourself in the sort of coming monetary maelstrom that's approaching.
Right. Well, once again, I want to thank you for joining us. We've been talking to Redmond Weissenberger. He is the director of the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Canada. That's Mises, M-I-S-E-S. You can check them out, as he said, www.mises.ca. And I'm sure Redmond wouldn't mind getting an email from a listener or two at redmond@mises.ca. Thanks, Redmond. We'll catch up with you again next month. Hopefully we'll have equally an enlightening conversation as this. Maybe we'll just carry on from where we left off.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Dave.